atravesando el transporte en tiempos de una
We
crisis
will
global.
begin with the first session of this conference, Decarbonizing the Economy in this Unprecedented Global Crisis. This panel is called Decarbonizing Transport and Recovering the Economy. Before I present the panelists, I would like to mention a few features for those of you who are just joining us. We have simultaneous interpretation into English, into Spanish, and into Portuguese. In order to do this, you have to select the globe icon on your Zoom app. Please bear in mind that you should not silence the original audio. Otherwise, you will not be able to hear the speakers when they are speaking your language of choice. You also have two functions available. In the chat, you will be able to receive messages from us with information that is important or of interest to you. And we also have the Q&A feature for questions and comments that will be compiled and conveyed to the speakers once they finish their presentation. This session, as well as all other sessions in this meeting, will be recorded and published in English and Spanish on the website of the conference. We will also share summary of the sessions today. For those of you who did not participate in the opening ceremony, I am Carolina Chantril. I will be moderating this panel, and I'm the coordinator of the Sustainable Mobility Team of the Sustentar Association. And this panel will be comprised of Nestor Roa. He is of the Transport Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Gonzalo Munoz, he is a Chilean high-level champion of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Jean-Paul Rodrigue, he is an international expert and an academic from the Hofstra University. And Jose Ba Rivero is the Dean of the Transportation Institute at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. On behalf of the organizing committee of this conference, we would like to welcome you and thank you for your participation in this session. As an introduction, and before I give you the floor, I would like to make a few remarks. As you very well know, this conference in the transport sector accounts for 23% of emissions within the energy sector, and this was mentioned by the authorities at the beginning of this conference. And according to some recent reports, the freight segment had increased its emissions about 75% between 2000 and 2015, and it is expected to continue growing, except for the uncertainty brought about by the pandemic. The speakers have mentioned at the beginning of the conference the importance of transport, both in the sense of the spread of the disease, but also in terms of the stocking of essential inputs, food products, etc. It is also important to mention the importance of maintaining economic activity while strengthening growing trends in terms of virtual and e-commerce. This was also mentioned before. This panel will focus on answering the following questions. How can the transport decarbonization agenda be adapted to this period of severe crisis? How transport decarbonization, economic recovery, and added resilience to transport systems can be combined? In the short and medium term, what will be the greatest challenges and opportunities to jointly address climate change mitigation and sustainable economic development? These are just starting points or questions that can be asked in terms of this subject, but we hope it will enrich the exchange of ideas in order to strengthen public policies in the sector and make them more dynamic so that they can be effectively and quickly implemented. Without further ado, I will introduce the first speaker. Nestor Roa, as I said before, is the chief of the transport division of the Inter-American Development Bank, IADB. He has worked at the IADB since 2001, and he currently coordinates the he is the chief of the Division of Transportation, and he has coordinated the transport divisions in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. He had a successful career in the Colombian public sector, where, among other positions, he was director and commissioner of the Communications Regulatory Commission. He has a master's in technology from the Sloan School of Business of MIT. He has a master's in transport engineering, and he has another degree in civil engineering in Bogota. Nestor, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Solo quiero verificar que me escuchan bien.
Carolina. Can you all hear me okay?
Gracias. Bueno, y es un placer para mí estar en este evento. Muchas gracias a ITF. Un agradecimiento a ti, Carolina, por la moderación, y a mis colegas de panel, Gonzalo, Jean-Paul y José,
and thank you, of
quienes
course,
sin
to my
duda
fellow
compartiremos
panelists with whom I will
muy
be
importantes de lo
sharing,
que
and
hemos
we
todos
will be sharing very
vivido.
fruitful
Yo voy a tratar
experiences.
de compartir mi
I will
pantalla,
try to
a
share
ver
my
si soy
screen.
exitoso.
I will see if I succeed in this endeavor.
Ok, ahí parece que
It seems to be working.
Compartiendo, ¿verdad? Bueno, perfecto.
Can you see my screen? Very well.
Sin más, yo creo que para hablar un poco del marco de recuperación económica y resiliencia hacia adelante, es clave centrarnos un poco en cómo ha sido la evolución de este proceso, que los días parecen semanas, como decían al principio, y las semanas parecen meses, pero en realidad es muy poco tiempo, y yo creo que vale la pena hacer un marco general de cómo hemos venido recorriendo esta emergencia, ¿no? Lo primero, que nosotros llamamos la fase 1,
Firstly,
y muy desde la perspectiva del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, es lo que nosotros llamaríamos la respuesta inmediata a la emergencia, ¿no? Desde que se reportó el primer caso, todos empezamos a prepararnos rápidamente. En el sector hubo declaración de estados de emergencia, cierre de fronteras, suspensión de vuelos internacionales y el transporte público, autoaislamiento, en algunos casos obligatorio, en otros casos voluntario, incluso enforcement muy importante con cuarentenas, toque de queda, y ese fue como la primera etapa que vivimos, ¿no? Aquí fue muy importante asegurar la continuidad de los servicios de transporte de carga, particularmente para los materiales esenciales, para los materiales médicos, a la vez que se aseguraba el servicio, ¿no? En la fase 2, que empieza más adelante, es donde empezamos un poco a ver cómo mitigamos las disrupciones que se dieron de manera generalizada en las cadenas de suministro. Acá la recuperación de los sistemas de transporte de carga, en el caso particular del banco, nosotros somos financiadores importantes de la infraestructura de transporte interurbano y urbano. Fue muy importante todo este proceso de adopción de protocolos de bioseguridad para la continuidad de las obras. Apoyamos mucho nosotros mediante eventos como en compartir rápidamente las ideas y los problemas que los países iban enfrentando. Y lo que se buscaba también era dar prioridad a la seguridad alimentaria y al acceso de capital de trabajo. Y luego, que es un poco lo que estamos empezando, hay un solapamiento entre esta etapa de mitigación, que durará un tiempo. Nosotros creemos por lo menos hasta que llegue a la estabilidad sanitaria, porque se puede hacer prevención, o existe una vacuna, como todos sabemos,
until there is some kind of prevention, some kind of vaccine, we are probably talking about 1 year, it depends. So facing forward, we will need to coexist and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. And I think here is where we can have a higher incidence from our perspective. So this is a bit of a chronology, a context in a little less than 6 months. and that sets the stage for many years to come, including sector-based dialogues and other issues.
Creo que se ha hablado en el panel de apertura del evento.
So
ha habido un shock de oferta y demanda
what
muy,
has
muy
happened
pronunciado,
is that there's been a
que ha
shock
tomado
on supply and demand, of course.
Un protagonismo
In our
muy
sector,
importante. Ha estado en los titulares de los diarios de todo el mundo, de todos los países, de todas
in
las
the
ciudades.
headlines of all the
Hay un shock de
newspapers
demanda,
throughout the
como mencionaba antes, de
world.
productos
Like I said, there's a demand shock for essential products such as toilet paper, cleaning products, alcohol,
termómetros, como la continuidad
thermometers, but
de
also
alimentos,
a shock on the continuity of food supply.
Y otros que se necesitaban, ¿no? De manera simultánea, se dio un shock de oferta en las cadenas
Simultaneously,
globales de
there was a
suministro,
shock of supply in
fábricas,
global supply chains.
De cadenas de suministro globales.
And of course, at a global level, there was a reduction in port operations, airport operations, and railway as well.
De insumos para el sector industrial, y creo que un caso
and this created some problems in the supply of industrial supplies. This created some problems in Latin America and Caribbean, especially in the automotive industry, which is a global supply chain that has suffered the impacts. This happened more specifically in our sector.
¿Y qué es lo que estamos viendo hacia adelante? Entonces, lo
what are
primero
we
es,
seeing facing forward?
hay un desafío de liquidez
There
en el
is
sector,
a liquidity challenge
que es más
in
amplio, esto
the
es importante
freight
entenderlo.
transport
Cuando hablamos
sector.
del transporte de
And it's
carga,
important to
no es solo un
understand that
problema de
when we
liquidez
talk
del
about
sistema
freight,
o el modo
we
de
are
transporte de
not
carga,
just
también
talking
del de pasajeros, y de hecho de toda la industria, ¿no? De toda la
about,
industria,
I
y
mean, we talk about freight
particularmente en
specifically,
América
but this
Latina,
affects the
donde la mayor
entire
composición del tejido
industry. And in Latin
productivo se
America,
basa en
the productive
microempresas y pequeñas y
network
medianas
is
empresas,
based
¿no?
on
Un
micro
ejercicio de
businesses and small
microsimulación que
businesses.
realizamos en
So
el
this is
banco
a
para estimar
bit
la solvencia de las
the
empresas de transporte,
simulation that we
específicamente
did
de
at the
carga,
bank to
considerando tres
analyze the
escenarios
solvency
de
of the
disminución
companies,
de ventas,
analyzing
¿no? 20,
3
40 y
scenarios,
60%,
20,
y
40, and
asumiendo que se
60%
tomaban
drop
medidas
in
similares de
sales,
rescate y de apoyo
considering
como
that
las que se
similar
toman en
measures
Europa,
were
que estarían pagos de
adopted
impuestos por un
for
año para
relief,
evitar
for
el
rescue,
financiamiento de las
tax
empresas a tasa de
exemptions, or
interés cero,
financing
y
these
ver si esto
companies
era
with a
suficiente
zero
para
interest rate,
reducir
etc.
por lo menos el
These
impacto
types of
inmediato
measures
del COVID.
to at least
Con estas
mitigate or
políticas en
reduce the
marcha,
impact of
nosotros lo
COVID-19.
que
And
vimos es
with
que
these
cerca de un
policies in
60% de las empresas
place,
de la región podrían seguir
60% of the
operando durante
companies
los
in the
primeros
region could
5 meses,
continue operating during the
desde que se
first
inició
5 months
la pandemia,
since the
sin
beginning
tener
of
que
the
despedir
pandemic
a personal. Una
without
de cada
having
dos
to
empresas
fire any
lo
staff
podría
members.
hacer en un escenario
And this could
moderado,
be
mientras que el
done in a
40%
moderate
apenas resistiría
scenario,
un choque
but
más
40%
acentuado. En
only
particular,
would resist
estas
this type of
políticas
shock of these policies.
amortiguarían el impacto en las
And they
microempresas,
would,
dado que 3 de 4 de ellas saldrían del mercado,
I mean, 3 out of
las que
4
corresponden
would
a
have to
Entonces tenemos
leave
un
their
desafío de
market.
liquidez
So we
en las
have a
empresas,
liquidity
y
challenge
en el
for
sistema,
companies.
un sistema que en muchos países se caracteriza por
And
una
this
participación
system
muy
in many
importante del sector
countries
informal, al cual es
has,
difícil llegar
I mean, a very
por parte del
strong
gobierno por los
informal
mecanismos
sector.
tradicionales, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos la
So we
secuencia
have
que estaba comentando de la crisis hasta el día
the
de hoy, lo que
sequence that I
viene
was
hacia adelante por el
mentioning,
próximo
the
año y
crisis that we
medio, y un
see
impacto
for the
más
future, for the
largo que
next
nosotros vemos
year
de
and a
5 años,
half, and of
y
course a
luego
longer
algunas
term impact.
oportunidades de este gran reto que estamos
I also see
observando,
opportunities
¿no?
within these
Y es
challenges that we
las
are
mejoras que se han
facing.
dado
The
en
improvements that
contaminación, y
we've
lo mencionaba
seen
la
in
ministra
the
y el
levels
ministro,
of
y varios de
contamination,
los
as was mentioned by the
participantes
ministers
en el panel
in the
de
opening
instalación.
remarks.
Tuvimos básicamente
We
un
had
experimento natural,
a
donde en la
natural
ciudad de Buenos Aires
experiment
solo el dióxido de
where
nitrógeno como
in the
referencia, si lo
city of
tomamos como
Buenos
referencia,
Aires,
la presencia de gases
taking
se redujo
as
hasta
a
en un
consideration
50%
carbon
en las primeras
dioxide,
semanas del
NO2,
confinamiento,
sorry, in the
según datos
atmosphere
oficiales. O
dropped
sea, estamos observando en
significantly,
varias
as we can
ciudades, y
see
esto lo
in the
podemos ver de
screen.
manera
So we are
repetida en
observing this
diferentes
in many
instancias,
cities, and we are
unos
seeing it
beneficios
repeatedly.
ambientales
So
inmediatos
the environmental benefits
y
that we are
temporales,
observing are
pero
immediate, and we can
importante
see it in
entender
real
que estos
time. But it's
beneficios no van a
important to
reemplazar
understand that these
las
benefits will
acciones
not replace
sobre
the
las que estamos ya
actions that we are already
y que eran
implementing
previo
and
a la
that we are
pandemia,
committed
y eso es muy
to and that
importante.
were
Pero sí
urgent even
es
before
una
the pandemic.
demostración de lo que se puede,
But it is
lograr.
proof
Pero
of
como
what
digo,
could be
nos
achieved.
podemos descuidar,
As
¿no?
I
La
said
recesión del
before,
2008, las
we
emisiones
should
mundiales de
not
CO2 se
neglect
redujeron solamente
these
en un 1%,
issues
y
because
luego
the reduction was
volvieron a
only
aumentar
1%
de
less,
manera
was
incluso
only
más
1%, but
acelerada,
then increased
precisamente
even
por los
more
estímulos de los planes de reactivación
quickly
económica que se
because
dieron
of the
en el
stimulus
mundo y en los
plans and
países,
the
¿no?
recovery measures that
Entonces,
were implemented in the different
¿qué
countries.
podemos hacer, no?
So what can we do?
Para conjugar de manera paralela el tema de decarbonización y reactivación económica.
How can we
Lo primero es usar
combine
los estímulos económicos para
decarbonization and
apoyar
economic
un
recovery?
cambio que
I think
aborde
that
la actual
the
emergencia
economic measures
climática,
have
¿no? O sea, todos los
to
apoyos de
include
recuperación
the issue
deberían
of
estar
climate change.
orientados
All
hacia
of the
que el nuevo
measures
normal sea mucho
aimed at
más
recovery
sostenible, ¿no?
have to focus on a
Y
new normal that
esta es una
is more
oportunidad para
sustainable. And this is an
estimular la
opportunity
innovación,
to
atender
stimulate
fallas de mercado que
innovation
ya
and
existen,
address market failures
introducir
that already exist.
eficiencias en los sistemas
Also, it
logísticos
needs
para
to
mejorar la calidad
introduce efficiency in logistics systems
de los
to
servicios, ¿no?
improve the
Y de
quality
esta
of
manera reducir
services.
las emisiones.
And in this
El
way,
nuevo rol
reduce
de la política pública
the new
debe
role
estar
of public
enfocado desde la cadena de
policies
suministro
must
para
be
entender
focused
mejor
on the
el
supply
sector,
chain to better understand the
particularmente temas
sector,
muy peculiares en América Latina y el Caribe, como
particularly
el tema de la
very
informalidad que
specific
mencionaba
issues of the LAC region.
adelante. Hacer énfasis en la regulación
So
técnica
focus on
es clave
technical
en los programas de
regulations
renovación de flota
is
que
essential
se vayan
to
realizando,
renew the
y en un
fleets
contexto
if that is to be
fiscal
done.
complejo que tienen todos los
Of
países,
course, the
necesidades
fiscal
de liquidez
scenario is
que
very
el sector
complex in these countries,
público
and
observa,
there
se
has to
requieren nuevos
be
esquemas de colaboración
public-private
público-privada. Va a haber muy pocos
collaboration.
recursos
There will
públicos
be very
disponibles en
few
general para
public
cualquier tipo de
resources
inversión.
available in
Entonces
general
se
for
tiene que
any kind of
apalancar y
investment. So
aprovechar
I
para
think we have
traer
to leverage
y
this
aprovechar esa
situation in
liquidez
order
que
to
sí existe
bring
en el
in
sector
that
privado
liquidity
hoy
that does
día, pero
exist
que
in
no
the
se puede
private sector
canalizar por la
nowadays,
problemática
but
de
that
riesgos que
cannot
tienen.
be channeled because of the
Y ya
problems
tratando
that
de
exist.
terminar, porque el tiempo
And now
está llegando,
I am reaching the
yo
end
creo
of my
que
presentation, and
tenemos que
I believe that
aprovechar y
we need
apalancar también
to
el tema
fully
de tecnología,
leverage
¿no?
the
Se han
issue of
mencionado varios temas
technology.
hoy, no voy a
This
profundizar
has been
mucho sobre
mentioned
ellos, pero
already,
vehículos
but of
cero
course,
emisiones, movilidad
focusing on zero-emission
eléctrica y
vehicles,
aplicaciones de
electric
tecnología como puede ser la
mobility, and
inteligencia artificial
applications of
para optimizar
technology
la
such
calidad de
as
los servicios,
artificial intelligence to
son
improve the quality of
elementos
services.
claves
These
que
are
tenemos que
key
tratar de
elements
aprovechar
that
mientras nos
we need to
aproximamos
fully
a este proceso de
leverage as
recuperación
we
más
approach
sostenible. El banco
this
como tal, y
sustainable
ya
future. Our
empezando a
bank
cerrar, está muy enfocado en
is
tratar de
focusing very strongly
apoyar este
on
proceso
supporting
este proceso
this
súper rápido
process
de atención a la crisis que se ha requerido. Lo
to
primero
deal
ha sido
with the
proveyendo
crisis. The
recursos
first one
financieros y
has
técnicos a
been
disposición de los
providing
países
financial and
miembros y
technical
empresas.
resources made available to countries and
Estamos
companies.
buscando
We
también apoyar
are
otras áreas
exploring the possibility of supporting
de
other
respuesta
areas
usando temas de recursos incluso asignados al
and
transporte, como puede ser
using resources for
reasignación de
transport
recursos que iba
and
para construcción
reallocating
de carreteras, se
resources
reasignaron
to
hacia la
build,
recuperación
maybe that
de
were meant to
hospitales
build
y adaptación de
roads, were
hospitales
rechanneled to build
nuevos para atender
hospitals, new hospitals
el pico.
to be able to
Hemos apoyado
contain
con
the
liquidez
peak
también las redes de
of the
seguridad para las
pandemic.
poblaciones
Also
vulnerables,
liquidity for
trabajadores en el
vulnerable
sector informal en
populations
particular.
and
Creo
people
que
in
por ahí
the
le llegamos de
informal
manera muy
sector.
importante a
I
los
think
trabajadores del sector transporte, de ese segmento
in the
informal que he venido
transport
mencionando.
sector of that
También ha habido acciones
informal
de defensa del tejido
segment, we've
productivo
reached
y
them,
empleo
and
mediante
also
financiamiento
promote
y
employment
garantías de liquidez que
through
se han
financing
canalizado a
and
través de los
ensuring
sectores financieros
liquidity
de los
that were
países, se están
channeled through the
canalizando en este
financial
momento
channels of the different
para las
countries
cadenas
in
de
order
suministro más
to
estratégicas,
maintain
y
the
lo
more
mismo por el lado
strategic
de los
supply
gobiernos, ¿no?
chains, and
Políticas
also
fiscales
the
para aliviar los impactos
government's
económicos
fiscal
que
policies
se han
to
venido
relieve the
observando. El banco
economic
también ha
impacts
estado
that have been observed. The
maximizando el uso
bank
de estos
has
instrumentos con los
maximized
países,
the use of these
y eso es como
instruments
la primera
together with the
etapa. Eso está
countries.
en
So this
marcha.
is the
Con eso
first
quedó
stage. This is
prácticamente
already in place,
comprometido los recursos del
and
banco del
the
2020.
resources of the
Ahora
bank
se
have
está
been
trabajando en
committed throughout
2021,
2020, and now we are
2022,
already
donde lo que
evaluating 2021 and
vemos hacia adelante
2022.
es que se requiere
And what
aún
we
más
see
liquidez.
facing the
Pero se tiene que
future is
empezar
the
a
need for
buscar
more
esa nueva
liquidity and
recuperación y
also
aprovechar
the
esos
need
pocos
to
recursos
find
que se
new
pueden
ways
dirigir
of
a la
recovery and
inversión
try to
para que esta inversión
maximize the
sea
use of
más
those
sostenible
resources
y más
so that this is a more
focalizado
sustainable
con una
investment
agenda
and more
estimulando o
focused
apoyando
on
agendas
an
proactivas
agenda
de crecimiento sostenible,
to
con
focus on
énfasis
more
particularmente
sustainable
en temas
growth
como infraestructura sostenible, lo
in
que sea
terms of
mantenimiento
sustainable
de infraestructuras
infrastructure,
críticas,
maintenance
mantenimiento de
of critical
empresas
infrastructure,
fundamentales
maintenance
para
of
para
essential
el sector, pero
companies for
también
the sector.
apoyo
But
específico a cadenas
also we need
productivas como pueden ser
to focus
aquellas que
specifically
aseguran
on
o
productive
permiten
chains
la
that
seguridad alimentaria que
ensure
requieren los
food
productos en nuestros
security,
países.
of course,
Esas son
required
las
by our
tareas pendientes.
countries.
Nosotros
So
vemos
these
muchos
are
retos
our
hacia
pending
adelante, pero
issues. We
también
see many challenges facing
creemos que es una
forward, but we
oportunidad y
also
no es
believe that
fácil
this is
aprovechar la
an
oportunidad
opportunity.
porque
And it's not
a
easy to
diferencia
really
de lo que
leverage this
teníamos antes de la
opportunity
pandemia,
because
hoy
as
día lo que
opposed to
tenemos
what we
es
had
muchos
before the
menos recursos
pandemic,
financieros.
today we have
Pero
fewer
creo que se puede
resources.
aprovechar esa
But I
oportunidad
think we can maximize
de escasez que se quiere
and
para
really
focalizar más esos
seize this
recursos financieros
opportunity
hacia
to
actividades de
allocate
inversión y política
financial
pública que
resources
sean
towards
mucho más
investment and public
sostenibles.
policies
Gracias.
measures in a more sustainable manner.
Yo lo dejaría por ahí, Carolina.
Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation. Carolina, you have the floor again.
Thank you very much, Nestor, for your presentation. I think it is very important what you have highlighted, the need to provide more liquidity to transport system, taking into account all the stakeholders in the region at a time, as you mentioned, when the availability of financial resources is scant. So from the point of view of sustainability, it's going to be a key point to understand how to align incentives, supports, and policies to be developed in the region in the next months and probably in the next years. Also, I think you've mentioned at the beginning the stages and how there's going to be an overlap between this first phase of understanding and responding to the emergency per se, trying to cure and prevent at the same time, and in the next stage, we will be able to, once we can find a cure or a vaccine, we will be able to work towards the recovery and the mitigation of impacts on our economies. Without further ado, I would like to remind the audience that you have the Q&A button available to be able to make questions, to ask questions to the panelists, and we will be reading them at the end of the presentations. Also, you can do so by using the hashtags Decarbonisation or Decarbonisation Transport Argentina in Twitter and LinkedIn in the conference group. Decarbonizing Transport Argentina is also the group available for that purpose. I will give you next the next panelist, who is John Paul Rodriguez. He is an expert and professor at Hofstra University. He has been the professor from different universities. Among other positions, Dr. Rodriguez sat on the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Future of Manufacturing between 2011 and 2016. In 2019, he was recipient of the Edward Ullman Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Field of Transport Geography by the American Association of Geographers. He also published widely in topics including maritime transport systems and logistics, global supply chains, and transport corridors. He was authored of 6 books, 32 books, chapters, and more. Dr. Rodriguez received his PhD from University of Montreal. Jean Paul, the floor is yours. Welcome to this conference.
Thank you for the introduction. So allow me, first of all, to express my thanks for the ITF for inviting me to take part in this conference. So now I'm going to share my screen and hope that everything runs smoothly. Okay. So let's begin. So in my short presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some of the challenges that we are facing right now regarding international trade in the logistics sectors. It's, I would say, quite a mitigated situation and I'm going to provide you some little bit of evidence or data to underline how the situation currently is very nuanced and I would say divergent in some way. I'll explain what I mean by this. A little bit of a repetition. This current pandemic is not a single event. It's a succession of events, a succession of phases, and which are characterized by different shocks on supply chain. It started up with China with a demand shock. This is well known. And then we move on into, a supply shock, and then move on to a demand shock with advanced economies where we have lockdown, and then a massive wave of adaptation, mitigation strategies. And now we're entering a very disturbing phase. And again, I'm simply speculating here. I call it divergence. That is, there are places which are now moving into a post-COVID situation, where things are gradually moving to normal, but there are other locations, including, unfortunately, the United States, parts of the United States, and also developing economies, if you look at the situation in Brazil and some Latin American countries as well, that are now facing, I would say, a full-fledged re-impact or full-fledged impact of this pandemic. So you're going to get some kind of a bipolar world for the next few months or so, in terms of places which have mitigated the situation relatively effectively and places which are struggling to deal with the situation. And this is not very conducive for international trade and international relations. It's going to create a lot of problems, and it's going to be very difficult to guess what they are, depending upon the level and extent of this divergence. Again, those figures are well known here in terms of the international trade. As far as the data currently can indicate, it's some kind of a replication of the financial crisis in terms of the level of the scale of it. That's what we have so far. So we have, but a very big difference concerning the current pandemic is it's an external shock, which means it was not linked with the system itself. It was linked with, obviously, with an external event. So if you look at this technically, you would say recovery should be very rapid because there's no, you could say, significant internal impact. But of course, what I say is not correct. What I mean by that is the external shock has created a variety of stress, a variety of impacts which have become internalized. Among them is financial, the demand, workplace, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how this is going to unfold, but it's very clear for the last decade or so, international trade was in a deflationary status process. And we'll see if this crisis is going to undermine it. So overall, I see 4 challenges because we're dealing with a crisis. The crisis is nothing new. It's not a new situation. It simply underlines the current weaknesses of the system. And there are many of them, and they are exposed, each and one of them, at the exact same time. And that's the problem of it. When you got the financial crisis a decade or so ago, it exposed the vulnerability of our financial system. But now pretty much everything is under stress. So it's a global stress test, as you can see, obviously. So it's going to create a rebalancing of supply chain. We'll see in terms of location, in terms of resilience. So that's going to be a very big topic over the coming years, is what type of supply chain we can build to include these risks. And it's going to involve the relocation of economic activity. It's going to involve duplication of supply, possibly, especially in some critical sectors such as the pharmaceutical industry. We learned very, very harsh lessons regarding this, that efficiency is not necessarily a resilience. And so that's something we're going to have to be addressing. The third part, which is excessively confusing, is right now we're seeing a global repricing of assets, repricing of commodities. And it creates a lot, I would say, of confusion, because what used to be abundant became scarce, and what used to be scarce could become abundant. And that creates a lot of confusion. And that brings up to what I call the current reset, or the Great Reset. And I'm not very enthusiastic about the future of globalization. We have reached peak globalization. We're going to see a setback, I would say a devolution of this process for the years to come. So allow me to go a little bit very quickly here. We all know that supply chain, a lot of what was driving a lot of them was to optimize or maximize the efficiency of non-material inputs, such as labor was very well known. But right now, with the process of automation, with the pandemic risk and resilient, it's going to probably reinforce the readjustment, possibly towards maximizing distribution and procurement efficiency, as opposed as minimizing non-material input costs. So what does it mean? Massive manufacturing, supply chain, relocation process. How far this is going to go, again, it remains to be seen. But again, you should not undermine, of course, as well, the power of the establishing industrial clusters. It's tough to declusterize something when it has happened. So don't discount China because, say, let's go out of China. China has many powerful manufacturing clusters. They cannot be undermined very quickly, but the trend is against that for a variety of reasons. So that's one aspect. Another aspect we have a little bit discussed so far is the variety of shocks that supply chain have been imposed upon, including supply shock themselves, the distribution shocks as well, and the demand shock as well. For instance, there was a lot of issue about hoarding. We realized that hoarding was not a problem. What was the problem is the shift in demand patterns from commercial, personal consumption away from institutional commercial demand, which means that many supply chains that were supplying retail stores or supplying restaurants were not adapted to supply consumers. And that we saw a massive substitution taking place because of that. It is something else which does not bode very well for decarbonization. Decarbonization could be the victim of its own success. And right now, the global price of many commodities, including oil, is dirt cheap. And financial assets are scarce, so pushing for a decarbonization agenda under the current circumstances will be excessively difficult because the competitiveness of the technologies are going to be eroded. And the more the technologies be imposed, the more some commodities get cheaper and the less competitive decarbonization can be. So you have to bear this in mind over the next few years or so. Because if I'm a company, why should I refurnish my fleet of truck while the price of energy is dirt cheap, while try to commit capital investment which is not available? And in a very high risk situation, as I say, good luck with that. Moving on, so here's what currently I speculate about what's currently in terms of the reset of the global economy. In terms of the workforce, and we saw a massive amount of furlough across the board. And when you reopen, corporations are asking a question, who do I hire back? And every corporation is now reassessing its labor need. And it's going to rehire based upon what is the most productive, what is the most valuable for my corporation. At the same time, you get telework, which made a lot of corporations realize, I did not need that much labor. And maybe some of the work can become contracting work with the power of telework. So that's something you have to bear in mind. Another aspect is all those cascading defaults. When people stop paying, it creates a form of debt chains. If, let's say, somebody does not pay their rent, it means that a bondholder will not receive money in the end. And that creates a cascading effect, which we are just starting to see. Wait when we'll see the default taking place in real estate, in manufacturing, in let's say in retail. All of this taking place as massive amount of companies decide that the current circumstances and the amount of cash is not prone to reopening. So that's something which you have to bear in mind. And the economies that are the most oriented towards the service sector are likely to be the economies which are the most vulnerable, which is paradoxical. Everything that is highly transactional in nature that requires human-to-human interaction obviously has become excessively vulnerable. And something as well that worries me is to what extent there's a scale effect behind this. To what extent the small companies are going to be more vulnerable than larger companies. So that's something we have not found so far. So we'll find out that. We saw some indication regarding this. And in terms of discretionary demand, it's essentially gone. The retail sector has been uncompromised. Travel, tourism has disappeared at the global level. Restoration has disappeared. The cruise industry is gone for a while. So it's going to take a long time to create this, recreate this discretionary demand, which so many economies depend upon. And last and not least, this reset involves a substitution. E-commerce has gained. It's very clear behind this. I wonder how people could have, I would say, be able to function within this pandemic without, I would say, an effective e-commerce structure. And that's create a massive surge for this. And it's going to create as well a massive surge of automation. So all of these substitution effects are going to have a very, very big impact on the global economy. And that's going to be essentially my last slide for my little intervention here is, again, are we reaching peak globalization? In the post-COVID concept, all international agreement, trade is subject to renegotiation, to questioning. I expect a surge of protectionism. We trying to create a borderless world, which is fine, but now with a pandemic and other issue, borders matters. And we start to realize that. Global migration has ceased as well. So all of this is going to create a lot of mistrust in international institutions, in my opinion, for the years to come. Obviously, in terms of production, it's going to create a surge of automation, surge of reshoring that's going to be taking place, and supply chain going to be reassessed in terms of their vulnerability, not in terms of their efficiency. That's going to be a very big risk. Transportation, as we have discussed, I expect an ongoing, continuing decline of the demand for international transportation across the board. Of course, some sectors are going to be more impacted than others, but this is going to be mitigated by a growth of e-commerce and online transaction. And last and not least, all of this is strongly deflationary. And deflation is going to continue for time to come, and all of this involves a repricing of things, revaluing what is a component of your economy. From the service sector, the manufacturing sector, all of this, everything is being, in some way, being repriced and reassessed regarding this. And with this said, that's all I have for now. I will, of course, open for question and discussion later on because I covered issues which obviously are quite controversial. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Paul, por tu presentación.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your presentation. I think it's very much aligned to what you've said about the impact, the cascade impact. The pandemic is an inverse cascade impacted from demand and the restrictions to supply chains and the transportation of passengers. And the payment will influence the liquidity of companies. So it exerts a higher pressure on the possibility of keeping these systems afloat. I think it is very important, and I'm sure it will mean a big challenge, and also a window of opportunity to rethink. But I think there is an important need in Latin American region, at least, to support these changes and these paths to rebalance systems in such a way that will allow us, in an inclusive manner, to keep the economy running. Next, I will introduce Gonzalo Muñoz. As I said before, he is the Chilean champion, high-level climate champion for the 25th Conference of the Parties. He has been appointed in this role as champion for the COP25. His role entails mobilizing climate action in non-state actors around the world, as well as advising the presidency of COP25. Among other ventures, Mr. Muñoz co-founded and ran Triciclos, one of the recognized Latin American companies in the circular economy, and now he's a member of Chile's National Advisory Committee of Water, Green Hydrogen, and Circular Economy. Gonzalo, the floor is yours, and welcome to the conference. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much, Carolina. I'm going to share.
I believe I need Jean-Paul to stop sharing so I can start my sharing, or you, Carolina? Yeah, great. I'll share my screen if I find here it is.
Voy a hacer la presentación en castellano. Me siento más cómodo en eso, entendiendo que hoy hay traducción simultánea, pero
given there is
muchas de las
simultaneous
láminas están en
interpretation, I'm
inglés, como
going
que también
to
sirven para el
give my
público
presentation in English, but
angloparlante.
many of the slides are written in
Muchas gracias,
English.
Carolina, por
Thank you very much,
esta
Carolina,
invitación.
for
Creo
your
que es
invitation.
tremendamente
I think
valioso
it is very
el tener la
valuable
posibilidad
to
de
have the possibility
aterrizar en lo que se
of
refiere a la Agenda Global de Acción
focusing
Climática,
on a
temas
global
que ya fueron
agenda of
debidamente
climate
tocados
change,
por Néstor y por
themes that have
Jean-Paul,
been appropriately
pero que en mi
addressed
caso
by
se refiere
Jean-Paul.
fundamentalmente al rol que le compete a las
But
empresas
in
y a los
my
gobiernos
case, is the role
subnacionales.
of the
En
role of
ese
governments
sentido, me
and
gustaría
companies. In
empezar
that
por
sense, I
hacer
would like
ciertas
to begin
referencias a cómo
by
estábamos
focusing
antes
on the way
del
we
periodo
used to
del COVID para
be
después ir aterrizando a qué es lo
prior
que tenemos que hacer
COVID,
ahora que estamos en el
to
COVID, ¿no?
focus
Y voy a hacer algo
on
muy concreto como
nowadays in
referirme
the
a
midst of
las
COVID.
recomendaciones que
And I'm
hizo
going to focus
el
on the
equipo de
recommendations
científicos
of
que
the
trabajaron en
team
el
of
contexto de la
scientists
COP
who worked
en
on
torno a
the at
movilidad y,
COP
por
in
supuesto,
terms
al
of
entorno de las ciudades.
mobility and
Este equipo, por supuesto, me imagino que para
cities.
todos
This
es
team,
lo evidente, ya tenía
I think it's evident,
totalmente
already had
ancladas las propuestas en torno a la
their
pirámide invertida,
proposals
en torno a la
in
lógica
place
de
in terms
cambiar,
of the
evitar
inverted
y
pyramid,
mejorar como
in
marco
terms of
referencial
improving
de la
as a
lógica de
reference work
transporte en la
framework
ciudad. O sea, ya veníamos
the
con un
transport
empuje
logic in
que nos
cities.
estaba
So we
mostrando
had a
que
focus
debíamos
that was
enfrentar un
already
mundo en el cual, desde luego, el
giving the
transporte
idea
activo
where the
representa
world
como una
had
oportunidad fundamental para el
the
desarrollo de nuestras
opportunity
ciudades.
to focus on
Esto tiene
certain
que
means
ver
of
mucho
transport for the
también
development
con
of a
cómo
city.
nosotros
This is very much
diseñamos y
related to the way
desarrollamos
we
modelos en torno a las ciudades
design
para no solo
develop
reducir las
models for
emisiones del
cities,
transporte,
not
sino
only to
también para un
reduce
mejor uso del
carbon
territorio. Por
emissions,
supuesto,
but
estamos
for a better
hablando
use of the
de
territory.
impuesto al
Of course,
carbono
we
como
are
algo
talking
importante,
about
la
the
movilidad
carbon tax,
sustentable, la planificación
sustainable
urbana como
mobility,
una
urban
lógica clave
planning
sobre la cual
as a
debemos
key
desarrollar toda esta
logic on the
conversación.
basis of which we have to develop this
La
conversation.
motorización, el transporte público y no
Public
motorizado
transport,
en el desarrollo de
in the
planes de mejora en
development
las
of
ciudades,
plans for improvements of the
mejores
city,
mecanismos y infraestructuras para el
better
funcionamiento, la
infrastructure
operación
and
y el
mechanism
financiamiento
for
de
the
transporte
financing
público.
of public
Todo lo que
transport.
tiene que ver incluso con
Everything that is
los
related
transportes más
to
cortos. Y voy pasando rápido porque
short
tampoco quiero detenerme en temas que desde luego son
length
importantes,
transport.
pero son muy
I'm going to
amplios de
go
repente para poder
quickly,
tocarlos en
but
profundidad en esta sesión. Quiero verlo de forma
I would like to
genérica. Las nuevas
focus
tecnologías,
on
por supuesto,
general
flotas
things, new
de bajas
technologies,
emisiones. Pero
fleet
déjenme
of
detenerme un momento
low
acá porque al
emissions.
final mucho de lo que estamos hablando tiene que
Much
ver
of what
con
we are
mejorar
talking about
nuestros modelos de
has to do
gobernanza locales. En muchas
with
ciudades en Latinoamérica y en el
local
mundo nos
governance.
encontramos con el desafío
On many
de
cities,
tener
we are
un
focusing on the
plan
challenges
territorial
of
mejor
having a
diseñado desde el
territorial
inicio que
plan that is
promueva la sustentabilidad y
better
al mismo
in
tiempo que
place
reduzca
to
las
promote sustainability
inequidades.
and at the
Y
same
eso
time
viniendo además
reducing inequalities.
desde Chile,
Also,
desde la dificultad que hemos vivido, como algunos
from
otros
Chile
países
and the
también de la región,
difficulties we have
en materia
faced in
de una
terms
crisis
of
social que
a
nace
social crisis
en muchos
that
ámbitos de
springs
lo
in
mal que han
different
estado
spheres,
planificadas nuestras
that springs
ciudades,
from
es
the
algo que
bad
creemos
planning
que
of our
debiera estar
cities. And I
presente en
think
este
this should
momento en
be
que
a
el COVID
focus
en muchos
nowadays
casos
when
también
COVID in
viene a
many
mostrarnos
cases
aún más
comes to
cómo se
show us
manifiestan esas
much
inequidades y por
more
otro
how
lado nos
those
ofrece una
inequalities are
oportunidad
manifested. So
patente a
we
través
have a
de los
very
planes de
clear
recuperación. ¿Cuánto,
opportunity
por lo tanto, en los
through
planes de
the
recuperación
recovery
podemos
channels,
poner en materia
how
de
much we
promover
can
sustentabilidad
focus
urbana y en
on
resolver
urban
inequidades?
sustainability
Si nos
and
vamos
solve
directamente a temas de
inequalities. If we
transporte, por
focus
supuesto
on
sabemos que el mundo
transportation, we
pre-COVID era
know
un
that
mundo
pre-COVID world
de
used to be
espacios
a world
crowded, ¿no?
of
Espacios
crowded
donde
spaces
la gente se aglomeraba
where
en el
people
transporte y sabemos
crowded
por lo
in
tanto que
transportation. And
esa
so we know
lógica
that
que
that
teníamos
logic
de
we used to
transportarnos
have
en grandes aglomeraciones es algo que
in big
definitivamente no
conglomerations is
podemos
something that we
continuar
can
por lo menos durante un tiempo y
we
quizás para
cannot have
siempre, y por lo
anymore,
tanto este
perhaps
desafío
forever.
de
So the
cómo
challenge
respetar
as to how
la
to
distancia social en el
respect the
transporte
social
público
distance
para todos quienes estamos acá pasa a ser uno de los grandes elementos
is one of the
fundamentales.
great key
Eso
elements.
implica
This
resolver un porcentaje
implies
importante que además
solving
se
an
expresan
important
en determinados
percentage
PIC, ¿no? Entonces, No es
that
solo
expresses
qué hago
itself
con este
in
exceso
certain
de
peaks. Not
demanda
only
sobre
what
el
I
sistema,
do
sino que
in
también
over-demand,
cómo
but
hago
also
para trabajar
how
sobre la misma lógica que
can
hemos
I
trabajado
work
como
on
sociedad
the
en materia del
same
COVID,
logic
en
as we
cuanto
have
a
worked
aplanar
in
ciertas
terms
curvas, a
of
disminuir esos picos.
flattening certain curves and
Entonces,
diminishing those peaks?
¿cómo vamos a hacer para manejar esos viajes que ya no entran en los buses y en los trenes? ¿Podemos incrementar la oferta o si
How
eso no es
will we
suficiente, qué van a hacer esos
improve this
pasajeros?
in
¿Será que
trains,
no
and
van a viajar?
how
¿Será que
will
van a
we improve the lives
potencialmente
of those
cambiar las horas? ¿Cuánto
passengers?
pueden
Will they
hacer
change
los
their hours?
empleadores
What can be
fundamentalmente o
done
los
in
colegios,
that
las
sense?
universidades, los
Schools,
espacios de destino
universities,
para modificar y
and
ayudar a aplanar
in
esa
order
curva del
to
transporte?
modify
Lo
and
que tenemos que
flatten that
evitar a toda
transportation
costa es
curve.
que
What
esos
we need
viajes
to
se nos
avoid
vayan a los vehículos
is
particulares, porque eso
for
sería
people to
realmente un
resort to their
drama en
personal
una serie de
vehicles,
dimensiones.
because
Eso
that
estamos
would
viendo, por
affect many
supuesto,
dimensions. We are
cómo
also
la
seeing
combinación
how
de
the
la bicicleta con el
combination
transporte
of
público se está
bicycles and
presentando
public
como una gran
transportation
oportunidad
is
que no solo tiene que
presenting
ver
an
con
important
cambiar
opportunity. This
rápidamente
not
o
only
acelerar
has to
procesos
do with
necesarios de cambio
changing
de
or
hábitos en
expediting
materia de
necessary
transporte,
changes
sino que
in
también como una
transportation
extraordinaria
habits, but
oportunidad de
also
implementación
presents
y
a
uso de los
very
planes de
interesting
recuperación, toda vez que
opportunity
además en muchos casos,
when
como lo de las
applying
ciclovías,
recovery
son
plans,
oportunidades
such as
de
maybe bicycle
generación de
paths. And this
empleo
is the
y
opportunity to create
oportunidad de cambio de
employment and
infraestructura
also make
que se puede
changes in the
testear
infrastructure.
rápido, ¿no? Yo creo que aquí
And this
entra la
can be
lógica del
easily
failing fast.
tested, and that's
Y por
where the
supuesto,
failing fast
en
logic
esa misma
comes into
lógica,
play.
el poder
Within the same
proponer
logic,
soluciones como lo
the
que
idea
está
of
proponiendo la
proposing
alcaldesa
solutions
Hidalgo
such
de
as
ciudades de 15 minutos
Mayor
y ver cuánto podemos
Hidalgo,
reorganizar las ciudades
these
para
15-minute rules, and
favorecer el
how we
que
can
un modelo
reorganize
de
cities
transporte como el de la
to favor
bicicleta
a transportation
y la
model
caminata
such as the
funcionen,
use of
creemos que es
bicycle, the use of
fundamental. Entonces, de
walking. I
alguna
believe
forma
this
hoy
is an
estamos también
essential
necesariamente
aspect.
desde la agenda de
I
los
think that
champions, buscando
today,
demostrar cómo tenemos una
within the
oportunidad
agenda of
única para
champions, we have to
devolverle
find this
espacio
unique
a los medios
opportunity
sustentables de
to
transporte, un espacio que
give a
durante
new
el último
role to
siglo le hemos estado
sustainable
dando
methods of
al vehículo particular. Aquí
transportation
tenemos una
and
lámina muy simple,
defavor the
digamos, de
use
cómo
of
un espacio
personal
vial
vehicles.
puede
This is
cambiar
a
rápidamente si es que
simple
le damos
outline of
una de
how the
las vías
scenario can change
a la
if we
bicicleta
give a
y cómo
lane
eso
to bicycles,
potencialmente acelera
and how that can
fundamentalmente la cantidad de
potentially
pasajeros por hora que podemos transportar.
accelerate or increase
En ese
the number of
sentido, mucho de lo que
passengers
hemos
that we can
aprendido tiene que
transport.
ver
In
con
this sense,
cuánto
much of
podemos
what we've
hacer
learned has to
para
do with
que
how
las personas
much
viajen
we
menos.
can
Ese
do for
mundo
people
se
to
nos ha
travel
presentado, por
less.
supuesto, de forma
This
dolorosa, pero
world
todos nosotros
has
potencialmente, creo
opened
yo,
up
nos hemos
in a
transportado mucho
very
menos durante este
accelerated
periodo.
manner, but
Pero
during this
también
period,
cuánto
we've
podemos
traveled
promover a través
much
del
less.
diseño,
But
menos
we also have
distancias
to
por
think
cada
how
viaje.
much we can
Y ahí
promote
empiezan las lógicas también
shorter
energéticas y
distances per
medioambientales desde el punto de vista de las
travel, and
emisiones, ¿no?
also
¿Cuánto
less travels
podemos
per person.
usar
Also
menos
from the point of
energía
view
por
of
kilómetro por
emissions, how
pasajero?
can we
¿Cuánto
use
podemos emitir
less
menos CO2 por cada
CO2
unidad de energía
emissions
que
per
utilicemos?
unit
Yo
of
creo que es el
energy that
momento
we
de
use?
plantearnos todas ellas y
I
no
think
solo
this is
concentrarnos
important to
en una.
consider,
Es
and not
importante que
just
tengamos
focus
una
on
visión que
one. We have to
contemple cada
focus
una
on
de las
all
cuatro
of them
decisiones.
with a holistic
Desde los
vision
Champions, nosotros
and
operamos desde el año 2015 en
considering
una
all these
plataforma
aspects.
que se llama
Since
el Marrakech
2015,
Partnership
we have a
y
platform
en
called the
global, en la Global
Marrakesh
Climate Action
Partnership within
Agenda,
the
en 9
Global
áreas
Climate Action
temáticas, más
Agenda,
bien 7 áreas temáticas y
and it has
2
7 thematic
transversales.
areas,
Dentro de las 7 áreas temáticas
cross-cutting
está
areas.
asentamientos
Within
humanos y
these 7
transporte como
thematic
dos
areas, we
fundamentales,
have
y dentro de
human
ello
settlements and
con
transport
Nigel
as
este
the two
año,
essential ones. And
Nigel Topping,
together
el
with
champion de la
Nigel this year,
COP26 del
he's the
Reino Unido,
champion in
estamos trabajando en
COP26 in
una
the United
serie
Kingdom.
de
We are
lo que llamamos
working
nosotros
on
procesos
a
de mapas
series
sistémicos
of
de transformación,
processes and systemic
entre los cuales está,
transformation
por
maps.
supuesto, el fin del motor de
Included
combustión
in this,
interna, por
we have the
supuesto,
end of
mejor
internal
infraestructura
combustion,
y
better
mejor
infrastructure, and
funcionamiento
of
de las
course,
ciudades.
better
En cada uno
functioning
de
of
estos
cities as a
subtemas que
whole.
coloco ahí, estamos
Each of
trabajando
these
con un equipo amplio
subtopics
que nos está
is
apoyando en
being worked
desarrollar
on,
los
and
mapas
we're
de
receiving a
transformación
lot of
sistémica.
support to develop
Y
systemic
esos mapas de
transformation
transformación
maps.
sistémica vienen a
These
contribuir
systemic
a lo que el
transformation
año pasado
maps
presentamos
are a
como los
contribution
1.5
to what we
Pathways.
presented
Cada una de las
last
áreas temáticas,
year, which are
incluyendo
the
el área
milestones
temática de
towards
transporte,
2050.
desarrolló una
This is in the
herramienta
issue of
llamada el
transport. Transport, and we
hacia los
developed
1,5
a
grados
tool
en el
called
área de transporte,
1.5
donde
pathways,
colocan ciertos milestones
and
fundamentales. Estos
certain
pathways hoy en día
milestones
los
were set
estamos
out, especially in
perfeccionando y
these pathways.
profundizando
This is being,
para
of course,
terminar,
perfected
ojalá este
in
año, con una
order
nueva
to
versión de
finish,
ellos
hopefully
y
this
llegar
year,
el
with a new
próximo año a
version,
Glasgow, a la
and
COP21,
maybe
un
next
elemento
year
cada vez más
get
sólido, muy bien
to
validado
the
por la
Conference of the
ciencia, donde
Parties
podamos
with
llegar
a
incluso
science-based
distintos
document that
ámbitos de
will
relación
focus
entre
on
los
the
diversos
different
1.5 pathways.
aspects of the
Esto no los quiero,
1.5
digamos,
pathways.
enredar con
I do
en
not
general
want to
cómo
bore
están
you
estructurados, pero los invito
with
a que
this
revisen
long
los
text,
pathways
but
y por
I
supuesto
encourage you
nos
to check
acompañen y
out
nos
the
contribuyan. Hoy en día
pathways.
una de las cosas que estamos haciendo con Nigel
One of the
es un
things
proceso
that
de
we are doing
feedback
with
para
NIGL is a
perfeccionar el
feedback
funcionamiento
process
del
to
Marrakesh Partnership. Sería
improve the
muy bueno
functioning
tener, por
of the
supuesto,
market
contribuciones de
partnership.
quienes están
And it would be
escuchando en la
very good
sala,
to have
ya
the
sea en materia de
contributions of
transporte, en materia
those of
de
you listening
ciudades,
today
gobiernos subnacionales,
in
etcétera.
terms
En
of
cualquiera de los ámbitos
cities,
necesitamos, por
subnational
supuesto,
governments, and
voces
in
expertas
all
que nos
the
puedan
areas, of
acompañar.
course, we need expert
Y uno de
voices
los
to
resultados
support us.
importantes que
One of
nosotros
the
hemos
important
desarrollado,
results that
además de,
we've
como les decía,
developed along
los 1.5
with
pathways
the 1.5
y los
pathways
transformation
and
maps,
the
es el
transformation
agrupar
maps is
a nivel
the
global todos aquellos actores no
grouping
estatales,
of
como decía antes,
all
empresas,
non-state
pueden ser ciudades,
stakeholders such
gobiernos
as
subnacionales a modo
cities,
de regiones,
companies, national
inversionistas,
governments,
sociedad civil, universidades,
investors, the civil
que estén
society, the
comprometidos con la
academic
carbono
sector,
neutralidad
all
como
of those that
máximo
are
al
committed
2050.
to carbon
Esa
neutrality
alianza que se llama la Climate Ambition
between
Alliance
now and
hoy tiene una campaña que se
2050.
llama
This
Race to
Climate
Zero,
Ambition
donde
Alliance
estamos
has a
invitando
campaign
a sumar
called
todo tipo de
Race to
voces
Zero,
para
and we
acelerar un
invite
proceso
all
hacia construir
walks of
ese
life to
mundo
join
resiliente y
this
carbono neutral antes del
initiative and to build
2050 y en
this
este caso
resilient
desde el
world
rol que
in
nos compete a los actores no
2050. In
estatales.
this
Estamos en un
case,
momento crítico,
from the
necesitamos
perspective of
que
state
todos quienes
actors.
entendemos la gravedad del
We
problema y
need to
entendemos que hoy
understand the
tenemos una
severity of
herramienta
the problem, and
fundamental
we also
basada en la
need to
carbono
understand that we have
neutralidad
a
antes del
fundamental
2050,
tool
se
to reach
comprometan y
carbon
puedan
neutrality
participar en este
before
caso a través de
2050,
Race
and
to
we
Zero.
need
Entonces,
everyone's
invito
commitment, in
a
this
quienes
case,
están en la
to
sala, ya sea desde
through
su
the
rol
Race to
como gobiernos
Zero
subnacionales o su rol como
initiative. In
personalidades
your
del transporte,
roles
universidades,
as
que se puedan sumar
important
a esta
figures within the
alianza.
transport sector
Muchísimas
or
gracias,
in
Carolina.
any
Un gusto de
capacity,
poder
I
seguir
invite you and
participando con
encourage you to
ustedes.
join us. Thank you, Carolina, for inviting me. Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your presentation. I think that your presentation also resonates and has to do with a lot of things that were mentioned before, in the sense that this is an opportunity to understand that the decisions that we make in the next few months or years have to be aligned with sustainability and aligned with a low emission development. I think that one thing you said is very important, and it's this opportunity to rethink governance systems, because at the end of the day, I believe personally that everything that has to do with development and with governance within these forums are extremely important, and it's where the actions materialize in the end. Finally, the importance of certain tools such as the pathways and all the tools that are being developed from your organization, all organizations participating in the COP. Of course, also all stakeholders are important, and I think what you mentioned in terms of the involvement and the participation of all stakeholders, not just governments, is essential to really promote ownership of this agenda. Having said this, I will introduce our last, but not least for that, our last panelist is Jose Ba Rivero. This is his bio. He is a transport planning and policy specialist with extensive experience in Argentina and Latin America. He has worked as a public official in Argentina, as well as in multilateral organizations, in transport companies. He's worked as a consultant and in the academic field. He is currently the Dean of the Transportation Institute of the National University of San Martin. Jose, you have the floor. Welcome to this virtual stage, and the microphone and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Carolina. Lo primero que voy a
Thank you
hacer
very much, Carolina. The first thing that I will do is share my screen, as we've all done. Above all, I would like to thank the International Transport Forum. I truly appreciate their work. The ITF was born 15 years ago, and there wasn't an organization before that that could see transport from a global perspective. So for me, it is an honor really to participate in an event organized by the ITF. The topic is very far-reaching, but I will focus more on freight than on passenger transport, and also focusing more on Latin America and Argentina specifically. One way of understanding freight transport at a regional level has to do with understanding interurban freight transport in Latin America. You can see here 6 pie charts for 6 different countries, and you can see the significant contribution of motor transport and the role of railways, which is relevant only in 2 countries. In Brazil, mostly related to the transport of minerals, and in Mexico, with its connection with the north. Navigation of maritime transport has relevance in certain countries, but it's connected to the transportation of hydrocarbons for maritime transport. This is for interurban. If we add to this freight transport at an urban level, which is exclusively done through motor transport, these percentages would be further enhanced. In Argentina, specifically for passenger transport, interurban passenger transport accounts for 90% of automotive transport. Train and plane are not as relevant. And for passenger transport, except in the metropolitan area where 10% is railway or the metro system, the rest is individual transport and public transportation, motor transport specifically. So this matrix in our transportation that is so highly focused on the motor transport obviously is related to the consumption of fuel. 80% in Argentina comes from fossil fuels. Gas has significant relevance, more than the world average, and also biofuels that have grown in the past few years. Of course, fossil fuels reflect in emissions, which you see on the right. They have grown, maybe not so much in the last years, but the country did not grow in the last few years. So when the economy stagnates, so does the use of fuel. If you consider the consumption of fuels and emissions together with other elements such as the strong motorization of society, the growing trend towards individual vehicle transport, I would say that this started at the beginning of the century. Just to define the beginning of this trend, it's where we reached more consensus in the sense of changing this paradigm. Civil society, NGOs, and the academic sector started promoting this trend. Slowly, the government started adopting this, mostly subnational at the beginning, and then later on, the national governments began adopting and consolidating this change of paradigm. Actually, countries in Latin America in 2015 signed the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, subscribed to these initiatives with a stronger focus on the environment, not so strongly focused on social problems or problems of access related to mobility, gender problems, etc., which are very relevant, were important. Also, economic and financial sustainability issues were not as widespread before COVID. The problems of financial sustainability of public transportation in Latin America was a major problem before this. The emphasis on the urban world and what could be done in the urban world was stronger and not so much on freight. But we've observed that freight transport has a potential for reduction, and there is a change of paradigm that is necessary in this sense. This was reflected, among other things, in national contributions of Latin American countries. They might not be sufficient right now, and they will be adjusted over the next few years. From the point of view of transport, I would say there is good news because national contributions have a strong presence of transport projects. And this is good news because the previous mechanism, which was the Kyoto Protocol, had no or virtually no transport focused projects. And now we are starting to observe them in this new context. Obviously, there's bad news as well. And this involves the fact that the proposals of modification of the transport sector are not so based on consent or agreed upon initiatives within the state level, but more environmental projects from that sector, from the environmental sector specifically. And I will explain this further. One could say that if we could look back and maybe think about the beginning of this year or last year, the general situation in the region was that ahead of us, we saw a change of paradigm, growing consensus for this change of paradigm, a change in the model of freight transportation, passenger transport, and that's where we were when this COVID-19 pandemic hit us. The short-term impact was very strong, but it has been already mentioned and described. But what we need to think about is that when this is in the past, what the world will look like. It's difficult to predict. There are many things that are uncertain. We can anticipate what type of impact we will see, maybe the scope or the timing, but some things are, of course, more difficult to predict. Undoubtedly, it will leave a lot of consequences in all sectors. Some of the consequences might be favorable. For example, the digitalization, the possibility of traveling less or traveling shorter distances, different services, shorter supply chains. These are probably positive impacts of the pandemic that might favor this road towards the new paradigm. But we will also see negative consequences, and this is for sure a problem that we need to deal with. One of them is the fear of people resorting to their individual vehicles at a greater level. This is a problem in Latin America in the sense which are motorcycles. The use of motorcycles has grown significantly in Latin American countries in the past years, and the probability of having a fatal accident on a motorcycle is approximately 20 times higher than having an accident in a car. So the massive use of motorcycles, if it is not handled carefully, can be very dangerous. I think other topics have been already discussed. Because the repricing of hydrocarbons that Jean-Paul mentioned, and the risk, of course, of building a transportation company that takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, a lot of human resources that have to work properly. So this situation can cause many problems and destroy values and social capital. So that has to be considered as well. I think that an important thing to consider is that we need to have a recovery agenda, an agenda that is aligned and that does not neglect in the search for economic recovery, does not neglect those changes that we were already implementing towards a more sustainable form of transport. If I look at Argentina, the context will be extremely harsh. extremely harsh because of the drop in income, the growing unemployment, growing poverty levels, difficulties to obtain credit and financing. It will be a really complex scenario. Undoubtedly is how to combine certain economic reactivation measure and employment promotion to relieve the social problems, but also combine it with cleaner and more resilient forms of transport. This can happen, but this involves an important requirement, and it is the following. These transport policies must include from the get-go different sectors. For example, it is different to think of a transport policy towards the future that does not include energy policies, environmental policies, productive development policies, and urban and habitat development policies as well. So this today appears with more clarity than ever before, even though we knew about it. Today it is clearer than ever. And this goes against sometimes certain institutional organizations where the state works in a very spread out way. So it's hard to centralize and discuss initiatives with common goals. So I think there is a conceptual difficulty in identifying the measures, but there's also an institutional deficiency to organize, define them, and implement them in an efficient manner. I would like to close my presentation by focusing on certain priorities with these criteria and developing systems that will contribute to growth. Imports in Argentina will be essential for this growth, and they have to be compatible with sustainable development. And of course, must be focused on building more resilient systems. Climate change and mitigation are issues that we deal with, but also this has a strong influence in the transport sector. So I propose 5 priorities that you see on the screen, and there is not one measure to save them all. Yes, there are 5 important measures that I believe must be implemented. Everything that can be done with freight transport, automotive freight transport is very important, because even if we have a shift towards railways, etc., trucks will always have a very important role in our economy, and there has to be a change there. It can have to do with the fuel or with more efficient operations, or the technology that offers today many opportunities to work in this sector. In terms of the modal change in Argentina with significant freight transport, the railways should have a more important role than it has today. This is not easy. It involves a lot of regulatory changes, but I believe that that is a potential that we need to leverage. Maritime transport is also important. Here we have more regulatory problems that need to be addressed. Also, the river transport is very important, and that connectivity through waterways is a challenge that must be faced. I think here there is a lot of problems that need to be addressed with the rainfall, with the level of the water of the Paraná River, especially here in Argentina, and of course import exports in the Buenos Aires area. I think there are challenges and decisions need to be made in this sense. And logistics related operations need to improve significantly. Small logistics firms are very important. They have a possibility of organizing, but I think this focuses more on large logistics operations that need to make better use of the equipment and have a more efficient operation. Finally, an important aspect, which is the fact that in Argentina, we have a lot of trade that is done through roads with neighboring countries, with Chile, especially, etc. So border crossings, which are critical points with significant major delays, would really benefit from an improvement, of course, in the infrastructure, for sure, but also making processes more agile, avoiding delays and misuse of the equipment. I think this problem needs to be addressed as well. So that is my message. And I think that there is a need to move forward with integrated strategies between transport policies and other public policies. Of course, probably one of the challenges in Chile is to harmonize public policies, having received maybe institutions that are better prepared to deal with these objectives. Now, these objectives have to be combined. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose, for your presentation. I think there are very many messages aligned today, and I think it's very important what you mentioned at the beginning as to the matrix, transportation matrix in Argentina, and how that is aligned to the energy matrix Minister Meoni mentioned at the beginning. And focusing on your presentation, the integration of the different sectors to tackle these challenges jointly. I think this is a key point. I would also like to highlight that you have also mentioned in other presentations the shocks in supply and demand in this pandemic period. But there are other positive aspects. For example, there have been certain changes that could be put to good use as if we consider them as part of the measures forward. I will close this session now to give room for the Q&A section. The exchange with participants is the richest part sometimes. I'm going to excuse Gonzalo Munoz. He had to leave due to other prior commitments, but if there are questions addressed to him, we are going to invite him to answer them in the different social media using the hashtag. I will begin with some of the questions that I consider quite relevant in terms of what's been discussed. This one is perhaps a bit general. I'm going to ask Nestor. We know that the decarbonizing agenda has been quite costly so far. It implies great investment, especially the initial investment for the restructuring and reconversion of vehicles. How do you think, from the bank focus point of view and other multilateral organisms, how do you think that this is going to take place after the pandemic to have a better access to funding and to implementing this when we consider higher economic and financial pressure? Thank you, Carolina. I think that we have to acknowledge the limits of fiscal resources of each country. This is a principle that before the COVID-19 was already an issue. We had this sort of rigid investment with certain assets from the past that we were not able to fully develop, such as roads. And we already had a restriction to take that step and to become, to get the infrastructure. Today, those challenges are even more notable, so I think it is important to take that into account. What does it remain? I think that it is not possible for countries. We do not have a real dimension of investment of the of
Lo que
structure,
queda
it will be
nos
important.
fuerza mucho a ser muy eficientes y eficaces. Y creemos que esa infraestructura se debe dirigir primero a aquellos
much more
áreas
efficient. We
donde
have to
más
address structures
sostenibilidad o
in
más
those areas where there is a higher need for more
posicionamientos y a un futuro más
sustainability
sostenible
toward a more
por decir
sustainable
algo,
future.
preferible hacer una inversión
It is
en
best to focus
mantenimiento
on
de
maintenance
ferrocarriles, donde hay
of
modos en
railway
competencia, como mencionaba
lines,
José hace un momento, que
as
no son
Jose
muchos los
mentioned,
países, frente a un proceso de inversión
in the
pública en
face of
expansión de una red
public
vial. Ese es el
investment
tipo de cosas que vamos a tener que
on
ver siempre
different
con muy pocos
means.
recursos. Lo siguiente es cómo
Next
maximizo esos
is
recursos, ¿no?
how
Entonces, hay
to
un rol
maximize
muy importante de
resources.
movilización de recursos del sector privado.
There is an important
Todos
mobilization from
sabemos,
the private
creo que en
sector.
este
We all
grupo, en
know,
este panel y en esta audiencia
in this panel at
no tenemos
least,
que convencernos mucho de
we
que
do
cuando
not
yo
have
hago
to
inversiones
convince
en
ourselves that when
sostenibilidad, en
I
general voy a
invest
tener
in
mayores eficiencias, incluso
sustainability,
más
I will
utilidades,
have
en
higher
un plazo probablemente
efficiencies
más largo que
in
que usualmente reconocen los
longer
mercados de
term than
capitales. Yo
usual.
creo que ese es el tipo de
I think
inversiones que nosotros,
this
y
is the type of
inversionistas que nosotros debemos
investment
tratar de canalizar y apalancar
we
los
should
recursos
channel
públicos
and leverage
para
public
atraer
resources
esos recursos de sector
to
privado
attract
dirigidos a
those
inversión en infraestructura
investments from the
o
private sector to
servicios que
invest in
pueden
structures and
retardar la
services
necesidad de esa
that
infraestructura.
could
Y aquí ya estamos
delay
hablando de
the need for a
tecnología, aquí
higher
estamos hablando de una
structure.
gran
We are talking
cantidad de
about
aspectos que pueden
a
aumentar
high
la eficiencia del
amount
uso de la
of different
infraestructura
aspects that can
existente y sobre
improve
esa base
the
aprovechar
existing
los
structure
fondos
and
climáticos
thus
que ya
make the
existen, ¿no?
most
Que
of
también
funds and
permitirían
existing
ayudarnos a
structures that would
apalancar todo esto.
allow
Creo que
us to leverage all that.
ese es
I
el cambio.
think
Desafortunadamente
that
no
is
es que
the
vaya a ser más
change. It's not
fácil,
that
yo creo que va a ser
it's
más
going to be
difícil de
any
hacer,
easier. I think it's even
pero
going to be harder.
precisamente
But it is precisely
yo entiendo que muchas de las maravillosas
because I
recetas
understand
de
that
comida
many
que
of
tenemos en
the
nuestros países para hacer
wonderful food recipes
algo
that we
muy
have in
difícil,
our
un poco
countries
más
to
amigable
make
en la discusión,
something friendlier in
recetas
our discussion.
de Colombia, de España,
Recipes
de
from
muchos de estos
Colombia,
países
Spain, and
vienen
many of
de
these
momentos de
countries
crisis y las
come from
mejores
times of
comidas han
crisis,
surgido
and the
cuando la
best
gente se pone a
food
pensar porque no tiene recursos, ¿no? Yo creo que eso es lo que
start
tenemos que apalancar y
are
el BID está
developed,
muy
the
enfocado
best meals
en
are
tratar de
developed
canalizar
when
todo
we
ese
do not
esfuerzo de
have enough
innovación de
resources.
los
So
sectores
we have
público,
to
privado
channel
y
on
sociedad
those
civil hacia esta
innovation
nueva
processes from
realidad.
the
Pero creo que
public
nos
and
tiene
private
que quedar
sector.
muy
But I
claro
think we have to
que hay unos
be
problemas
very
fiscales
clear that
enormes,
there
¿no?
are
Y
huge
no
fiscal
alcanza los
problems.
trillones de
It
dólares
is
ni siquiera en
not
los
enough
países
to have all the
desarrollados
billions of dollars
para solventar lo que hacíamos antes.
to
Ese escenario ya no
finance
existe.
what we
Como
used to
diría uno en
do.
inglés, we have to move on, en un
We have
escenario
to
mucho
move
más
on
restringido de
in
recursos
a
financieros, pero
much
totalmente amplio
restricted
en potenciales de
scenario,
innovación, tecnología
but with a
y
potential for
creatividad, ¿no?
innovation
Y con
on
una demostración clara, ¿no?
technology, with
De
a
lo que se puede
clear
hacer
focus on what
cuando
can
los
be done
modos de transporte se utilizan
when
o
modes of
se dejan de
transport are
utilizar
used
cuando
or
no es
are
eficiente
no
utilizar,
longer
¿no?
used.
Gracias, Néstor. Y en seguimiento a
Thank you, Nestor. And as a follow-up, perhaps I can invite later Jean Paul or Jose to comment on this, but you talked about leveraging and synergize resources that come from the public as well as the private sector. So how do you think that can be consolidated in terms of dialogue and trust from the private sector in order to increase better public-private partnership
Yo creo
to
que en general, y
finance
esto ya venía
actions?
pasando
I
desde
think
antes, por lo
this
menos en el
started
banco,
happening before
los que hemos
when
trabajado en el sector público sabemos que
those of
en el
us who
pasado,
worked in
por
the
ejemplo, la
public sector
relación del
know that in the
sector
past,
público con el sector privado era
the
muy lejana, ¿no?
public-private
Era
partnership
en el
was
mejor de los casos a
far.
través de un contrato
In the best
de
of
lo que
cases,
fuera, ¿no?
is
De
by
obra,
means
de
of an
concesión,
agreement, of
muy prescrito, muy
service agreement.
definida.
It's something
Yo
very
creo que se
well
requiere
defined.
pasar a
And I
relaciones un
think
poco
we have
más
to
cercanas, más de
pass
largo plazo,
to
más de
closer
colaboración entre
relations,
sectores
to more
público y
collaborative
privado. Creo que ese es un cambio
relations
grande que
between both
tenemos que
sectors. I
hacer
think
desde el
that's
punto
a
de
big
vista de la política
change we
pública.
have to focus on.
Muchas gracias. No sé si
Thank you very much. Jose he would like to add something. Yes. I share with Nestor that there is a higher proximity between the private and public sectors Privates are operators of traditional transportation, but in the last decades, they also participate in very strong, very hefty investments, airports, structures, high-intensity roads. I think that when we have a crisis such as this, it is very complicated to articulate public-private systems. In 2002, when we had a very deep economic crisis, at that time, the transport of passengers and highways and airports was 20% lower. Now there's much more. So a private person who has made an investment, when has to recover the investment and the number of users lower a lot, well, how is he going to go about it? So we have to rethink all contracts. I would strongly wish for the possibility of using private resources when it's abundant, with where the public sector will have a scarcity of resources. But we will have to see the mechanisms that will allow us in the future. I think that in these circumstances, it's going to be even more difficult. Thank you, Jose, for your contribution and your clarification. Now I will continue with a question for Jean-Paul. I'm going to read it in English so as not to get lost in translation.
If the service sector is going to be more affected, not so much bulk and commodities, does this mean economies that are producers or exporters of commodities can have an opportunity like Argentina? And how this trend can be impacted from deglobalization?
Yes, that's a complex, I would say, issue. What I can imagine at this point is the fact, and again, it's going to be a mutual negative reinforcement cycle, is the high service economies are at the same time the high demand economies, such as North America and Europe. So therefore, if the service sector is deeply impacted, the economies that are exporting resources, again, it depends on the type of resource. I don't think the agri sector is going to be as impacted as, let's say, mineral products, or you could say the energy sector are going to be also negatively impacted as well. So that's my concern, is the driver would be the vulnerability of service-oriented economy that are going to undertake a massive restructuring of their labor composition because of the pandemic. And also one of my biggest fear is, I start to observe it, is the growing cognitive dissonance between the public sector, which has its goal and aspirations, and the economic reality, which is different. And you push for an agenda which does not necessarily reflect the emerging reality, which is taking place, let's say, within metropolitan areas, within economic sectors. So that's one of my concern. And also it's exacerbated the fact we don't know at this point what this new reality is. So tread carefully with your agendas. Be very careful, because this reality is unfolding as we speak. So that's, again, that's the best I can say at this point in time.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Paul, por tu intervención. Quisiera saber si...
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for your intervention. Perhaps Nestor or Jose would like to add something. If not, we will continue with the next question.
A mí me gustaría...
I would like to go back to what Nestor mentioned in his presentation with reference to, I mean, he mentioned that he should take an advantage of the contingency, and this is somewhat aligned to the question, be it from the point of view of generating these changes from the technical point of view, from the logistic and structures, but also institutional and regulatory changes in order to strengthen the system as a whole. And in that sense, one of the things that we were wondering about are the regulatory and governance changes take a lot of time because it involves a lot of red tape and agreements that are not so swift. So how do you think we can somehow dynamize those processes at a time when we need to take faster action so that these changes can be operated on faster than the possibility to going back to business as usual, as to the way we used to move about prior to the pandemic?
Bueno, yo creo que la oportunidad que estamos viendo hoy día,
the opportunity we are seeing nowadays,
digamos que hay una prueba fehaciente de todo lo que han logrado hacer muchas de las ciudades y países en reacción a la pandemia
what
como tal,
many countries and cities were able
capacidad
to
regulatoria,
do in
de
terms
atender
of
unas fallas estructurales que han
regulatory
ocurrido
capacities and
en los
to
mercados,
address
¿no? Hay países que han
structural
logrado en
failures.
alguna
There are
medida
countries that have somehow
subsanar la falencia que tuvo el
succeeded
sector
in
financiero para atender ciertas necesidades del consumo. Eso es algo que en muy
mending,
poco
so as to
tiempo
speak, the financial sector. This is something that was
hacer, ¿no? Y creo que
achieved
fue
in a short
como que
period
se
of
generó un
time.
efecto de
And this
cooperación entre los
generated a
diferentes agentes
cooperation effect
de la política pública y de la economía
in public
política
policies and
de estas
the
decisiones que llevó
political economy
a tomar acciones fundamentales que en
that
muchos
led
casos
us to take
han
key
mantenido incluso muy
actions
controlada
that kept everything very
la
much
expansión
closely focused
de la
on
infección del virus,
in
¿no?
order to prevent
No
the
es
spread of
fácil
the
simular
virus. It is not
a
easy to
futuro ese
simulate
comportamiento.
that behavior
Desafortunadamente,
in the
yo creo que a
future.
medida que pasen los meses,
Unfortunately, I think that as
las semanas
months
que son
go
como meses
by
y que es
and
parte
weeks that
del tema,
seem
¿no? Cuando
like
yo tengo que
months,
hacer algo tan rápido,
when
las administraciones
we
públicas se
have to
mueven
tackle
muy rápido. Yo
things,
pensaría que
we
el
have to
tema
move
es
swiftly. I think
actuar y promover muy rápido, ¿no?
the
Que todos
question
los
is
stakeholders
acting
que
and
tenemos algo que ver en este tema
promoting things
nos movamos lo
quickly
más rápido que
so that
podamos
all
para
stakeholders
darle
can move as
herramientas a quien
swiftly as
corresponda
possible
tomar la decisión, bien sea alguien de sociedad civil, bien sea una
to take
multilateral como nosotros.
fast actions.
Nosotros, y creo que la tecnología
And I think
es un
technology
tema que puede ayudar mucho en esto, porque la
can be
tecnología de alguna
quite
manera es
helpful
innovación, no
because
está muy
somehow it
regulada,
means
puede definir
innovation,
nuevas realidades, de
it
hecho
can
lo hemos visto en
define
otras
new
industrias.
realities. In fact, we've seen in
Yo
other
creo
industries
que
that,
buscar esas
and I
respuestas en
think
ese
that
tipo
to seek
de actividades nuevas,
that type of
más que en las
response from
actividades del
new
pasado,
activities more
puede generar
rather than activities
mantener
from
esa
the past
dinámica, ¿no? Que
can
desafortunadamente
keep
yo creo que va a ir
that
bajando, ¿no? Como todo en el
dynamic, and I
mundo,
will see
yo
that
creo que nos
going
vamos a ir
down.
acomodando.
We will
Eh,
start,
Uno no siente eso mismo, las burocracias
accommodating
vuelven, ¿no? O sea,
ourselves.
la burocracia en un momento dado
You feel that
desapareció
red tape
por sustracción de materia.
disappeared
Nos tomó a todos
at a
mucho tiempo,
certain
por ejemplo,
point.
poder
It
hacer estos
takes
eventos que hoy día
us
se hacen con una
a lot
eficiencia
of time
única. Por ejemplo, un evento como este.
make to organize events such as
Me temo que
these.
con el tiempo, poco a
And
poco,
I
nos vamos
think
a
that with
inventar
time,
procesos y
little by little, we
procedimientos,
will find
y por
ourselves
eso es que hay
in
que ser
procedures,
muy
in different
rápidos en
procedures. And
actuar en
so
estos
we have to
primeros
act
meses que van a
quickly
definir los
in these
próximos 5
first
años. Y
months
esos 5
that are
años van a
going
ser
to lead to
cruciales
the
para las
next
próximas
5
3
years.
décadas.
And
Creo
those
que es
5 years are going to
un
be
enfoque de
crucial.
ese estilo que
I
todos
think
individualmente
it's a
deberíamos
focus
impulsar
that
desde el
we are
interior de
all
nuestras organizaciones. Y
individually
en el
have
DIF nosotros estamos tratando de
focused on. And at IDB, we are focusing on that as well. Thank you, Nestor. Next, I will focus on a question with Jose. I'm going to read it in English.
Do you think that centralizing services will have a more positive impact post-COVID? Will this lead to or require measures that penalize carbon-intensive options for cross-subsidizing?
Bueno, entiendo por centralización o descentralización.
I understand as decentralizing that decision-making are focused on subnational levels. That's the way at least I understand the question. When we talk about the state in general, we have assumed the federal state, and in transport, many of these spheres are taken by subnational state, provincial level. urban transport is specially controlled by the provinces. I think that in that sense, a crisis of this magnitude should help us to establish the roles of the national and provincial levels on different topics, especially when we talk about, for example, urban transport and the railway line. I think that the role of the federal government should be to outline the general the roadmap, and the subnational should gain, at subnational level, should gain in autonomy and capacity to take responsibility also for all these changes that we have to implement. That's the way I understand the question. I hope I understood it correctly. Thank you very much, Jose. Now I'm going to take a couple more questions to round up on time. I'm going to go next with a question for John Paul. You spoke of supply and demand. What we can see is that they have mentioned the question of passenger transport, and they spoke about low demand models or demand-driven models. Do you think there is an opportunity? And I'm going to add to this question the question of multimodality. In the case of passenger transportation, we work on those topics, and there's a lot of innovation on these topics, thinking of business models in passenger transport. Do you think there's an opportunity to think of the distribution chain in a similar way to these concepts of multi-modes and demand-driven, to be able to somehow lower the impact and make distribution chain more efficient and transport to better improve business models?
Okay. In my opinion, one of the key driver in the years to come about this process for freight is going to be e-commerce. And the e-commerce firm are already establishing their own multimodal freight distribution systems with their own supply chain, their country, taking control of logistics. So the activity, it's going to be essentially a private initiative. And we saw that in the United States, where you saw a dramatic surge in a shift in the demand, freight demand patterns, which led many sectors scramble to provide additional services for home deliveries, while commercial deliveries were plummeting. And what we realized that the Amazons of this world, for instance, were already having a multimodal national distribution type of strategy. And this process is going to reinforce and essentially their command of the distribution process. So that's, I would say, the best I can say regarding this, if any others would like to add to this process.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Paul, por tu comentario.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for your comment. I will now ask Jose a question. The question is related to the changes in the matrix and the changes in the modality of freight transport in Argentina. The question is, what do you think are the most relevant aspects in order to address in a more rapid and efficient manner the change or the shift towards railway systems or port and fluvial transport as a way to strengthen transportation methods and leverage the opportunity that we have in front of us today?
Sí, José,
Carolina, para mí la pregunta. Ok, perfecto.
Sí, claro.
Bueno, sí, la implementación de esas cosas no es fácil. Yo creo que
it's not easy to implement these systems. I believe that sometimes we use the terms policies, plans, this terminology we use, policies and plans as interchangeable terms. And I think there is a significant difference between, first of all, having clarity in the guidelines, in the aspirations, In this sense, we're talking about a sector, such as transport sector, in a country. And then we have the plans, how to execute these aspirations. I think in Argentina, there are no clear policies. We haven't had clear policies for many years. There are efforts being made, but it is not being executed properly. I think policies have to be executed through specific plans. And I think that we have to focus on more operative issues. One of the things that was in the question, in your question, was the railways or the navigable ports. First of all, we need to define what we want. Sometimes a sector is labeled or as a service provider, and sometimes we ignore or we underestimate the environmental impacts it might have. So I think we have to put everything into the equation. There are many countries, many regions that have established policies and guidelines and then have transferred that onto specific and concrete plans. And of course, you need data, you need analysis, and you need a professional execution of these plans. I don't think we're in a good position. I started working within the state level I started working 45 years ago, and I have been very close to all the policies. And I think there is a weakness there. And I think the political aspect, not a political party in particular, but in general, in the political spectrum, they need to consider how important this is in order to develop policies, but also to really transfer this to concrete and specific plans. I think that we had a challenge before, but now we have a stronger challenge ahead of us, which is at the institutional level, with all of these institutions that must be prepared to address the challenges and the complexities of this issue. Thank you, Jose. I will ask the final question and then we will close the panel. I will ask Nestor about how we will work with the transport sector. In our country and in the region, there is a strong participation of carriers, of small carriers, SMEs, and individual carriers, even family-owned companies that have greater difficulties, as was mentioned before, greater difficulties to be able to include and adopt changes in their operation. And they might be the sector that is most affected within the transport sector as a whole by the crisis. How do you think we can involve them? How can we work with them in order to involve them in these discussions and promote a more sustainable form of transport?
Cierto que tienen unos niveles de representatividad importantes.
I think that they have chambers and federations that group them, so there can be good dialogue maybe through these associations. I think that there has to be discussions, and discussions were never interrupted. And of course, consensus needs to be attained. I think that within this strong crisis, small and medium-sized companies are suffering the highest impacts. If you have 40 trucks and personnel that you have to pay their salaries, but with no activity, they have a high chance of going bankrupt. An individual who has a vehicle and has very little work, they may have a higher possibility of surviving. So the impact of COVID on freight transport companies is very different, because within freights there are segments. There are companies working on certain types of products and which have maintained their level of activity. They have suffered no negative impact. In May of this year, for example, in Argentina, we've had practically 20% more grain export activity than last year. In ports and through other methods, this has continued. working. In other sectors, on the other hand, they've had no activity. So it's very different within the freight transport sector. It is important to engage in dialogue, but that's not much of a problem. This involves, of course, involving the carriers, but also involving those who own the cargo, the owners of the cargo. The role of the state is to ensure that transport is carried out effectively and correctly. And of course, this involves the survival of the carriers, but also the maintenance of the prices for users. So a balance has to be reached for those who provide the services.
Sigo yo, ¿no, Carolina? Sí, gracias, Carolina. Y yo hago eco en lo que estaba diciendo José, como siempre. Y no solo lo que dijo ahorita, sino lo que mencionó antes, ¿no? Que uno, después de muchos años de estar en el gobierno, uno ve realmente, o en el gobierno, o trabajando cerca de los gobiernos, uno ve que hay avances grandes, pero que es mucho lo que nos falta, ¿no?
Big steps are taken
Yo creo
forward,
que
but there's also a lot of things that are still missing. I believe that governments will move slowly in certain aspects because many of the problems are further worsened because of COVID, and we need to consider more broad topics such as informality, which are there and that will not change in the short and medium term. This affects, of course, freight transport because it affects the mesh of the industrial sector. I think this is happening more and more. And as you mentioned, we need to understand not just the carriers and what's happening to them, but we also need to understand those who require their services. We need to understand the business mentality of the entire productive chain and the supply chains as well, in order to really bring them into the sector and involve them. Before, we only had this was just like a role within the sector, just for the issue of transport. But now transport is integrated into the entire value chain, from marketing to basic production of inputs that go into any productive system, regardless of the industry. And industries themselves have merged. A manufacturing industry is not that different from a service industry. They are intertwined. And therefore, we need to understand them in combination. You cannot think of the elements in isolation. The Michael Porter model no longer applies. So I think this is something that needs to be changed. From our perspective, as the industry, we need to change our vision, which is very specialized. Of course, we need to maintain the relevance of this specialization, but understanding the workings of the capital markets, of the industry A, industry Z, in order to really provide more specific solutions and engage in a more focused dialogue with private actors. I think that the sector will become professionalized, as Jose said. That is a need, and it hasn't been done enough, but it will take longer. Those of us who are already part of a professionalized service, we need to help other sectors become more professional as well. This is essential in order to engage in more effective dialogue with private actors, because they do not even know their clients well, yes, but private operators within the transport sector that work with multinationals, they don't need much help. The help is needed by the other ones. So thank you. Sorry, Carolina. It was a very important thing to say. I took a little longer than what was awarded. Thank you, Nestor, for your comment. We will close the session now because we are going a bit over the time that we had defined for the session. I would like to remind you that you can continue asking questions or use our hashtag on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Check out the hashtags here on the screen. I would also like to mention the fact that this is the first panel of a series of conferences and discussions that will continue throughout the month of July. Road freight, of course, is a topic that we will cover tomorrow. This was touched upon, of course, today, but you can continue discussing this tomorrow. Like I said, we start at 10 a.m. Argentina time, 3 p.m. Paris time. Please check that you have the time right, and hopefully you will be able to join us tomorrow as well. I would like to remind you also that we will share information, presentations, and videos on our web and on social media. I would also like to thank the panelists, our distinguished speakers today, Nestor, Gonzalo, Jean-Paul, Jose. Thank you so much for your contributions, for the fruitful dialogue. I would also like to thank the participants who joined us, everyone who connected and asked questions, etc. We believe this is extremely important in order to promote the decarbonization agenda in the transport sector. Finally, on behalf of the organizers of the International Transport Forum, the Wuppertal Institute, the Sustaintar Association, we would like to thank you for this fruitful exchange, and we hope that you can participate in tomorrow's session. Thank you.